Good evening. It's wonderful to be here to join you at the beginning of a journey of something that will become a feature of this city, that will tell the story of this city and this country. All I've ever wanted to do is do history. It was the only thing I was ever any good at school. It was the only thing I was ever interested in. And if you're monomaniacal, if you only care about one thing, you have to learn to do it in as many ways as possible. So I delivered history on the page, in radio, and on television. And it's only recently I've got involved in museums, the other delivery system for history. And yet, when I was a child, museums were really at the centre of my interest in the past. And history mattered to me as a child because it contained the stories that made sense of who I was, made sense of my family, made sense of the fact that I was an immigrant. I'd been born by the River Niger in Nigeria, but I was being brought up by the River Tyne in the northeast of England. And history explained the forces of migration and movement, of empire and travel, that explained and made sense, not just to me, but to people around me, of why I existed. Migration is the great subplot of British history. It's the factor that its DNA is in so many of the other elements of British history. It's everywhere, and yet often it's not talked about. There are people tonight celebrating Halloween for whom the story of migration is more frightening than anything they're going to encounter knocking on their door. And yet it's also just a basic fact of family life. It's a comfortable, inevitable, ubiquitous fact. And its obviousness and its essentialness is growing. 1 in 3 school-age children in this country at the moment are BME. On top of that are the vast number of children whose migration stories of their families aren't recorded, aren't recognised, aren't visible in that racial sense. One of the ways in which that reality, that future projection of how migration and movement, diversity, is the story of Britain, one of the ways it was brought home to us recently was this summer in the World Cup. The England team that played in the World Cup, that I don't need to remind you got to the semi-finals, back when it was sunny and warm. That was the most diverse team that we've ever had. 11 of the 23-man squad were black or mixed race, and again, like the children in school, those statistics don't tell the full story because other members of that squad were also the products of migratory stories. Harry Kane's family are Irish. I don't know if anyone's done it, but I'd be interested to know how many goals we scored by people whose families weren't connected to migration, and I wonder how far we would have got beyond the group stage were it not for these migratory stories. That England team, led by a visionary genius manager, it's a canary in the coal mine. It's the future projection of what Britain is going to look like, because we are beginning to look in all sorts of ways, in our language, our cuisine, our interactions, our families, and of course the faces that we see in our cities. We are beginning to look like the country that in some ways we always should have been, a country at ease with migration and diversity. That was almost always our fate, not always in visible ways. That was always part of the story. For 800 years, that's been part of our story. And yet there are people who will convince themselves that Britain is this island, an empire in and of itself. This place untouched by the rest of the world. If there's any nation that can claim to be insular, that can claim to have a history and a past and a story that is not global, it is not Britain. The most global country there's ever been. One of the ways historians like to talk about that is to take our national drink, tea. Which of course tea comes from China. We didn't have anything the Chinese wanted to buy, so we ended up growing it in India. We tried at first to sell the Chinese tea by using our main export at the time, which was wool. It's very hard, no matter how good a salesman you are, to convince a man wearing silk that what he really needs is some wool. By the end of the 19th century, there were 1 million people in India producing tea for the British, but unlike the Chinese, we drank that tea sweetened with sugar, and that sugar was produced through another part of British history, the history of slavery. Sugar comes from Asia. We discovered it, we encountered it, I should say, in the New World in Brazil, and we grew it on the islands of the Caribbean with African labour. An Asian crop grown in the New World in the Americas by Africans for consumption in Europe, and when we consumed it in Europe, we did so in China. Crockery that came from China. The only English, indigenous thing in an English cup of tea is the milk, except for our cows are Dutch. Even they are migrants. And I say this not because an English cup of tea isn't English. It's quintessentially English because it is created by the global journeys of millions of us and millions of our families. The story of migration is the story of Britain. The island story version that we sometimes still hear peddled as the alternative vision, a monochrome delusion of our past that cannot survive in a country in which 1 in 3 children are BME, in which the majority of our goals are scored by the children of migrants, more importantly, and in a country that is projected to produce a museum to celebrate this essential part of our past. And I really urge you to get more involved in this project to create this museum, because London, of all cities on earth, the most diverse city in the world, far more than New York, if anywhere should have a building to celebrate the story of migration, it has to be the world's capital, London. Thank you very much.